Welcome back to the Femme FC Podcast. I'm excited for today's episode with Andy McKeown. Andy's from a small town in Scotland and grew up playing football and basketball. He started coaching at 17, coaching the youth basketball team at his high school, and continued as a sports coach in a few different capacities for the following 10 years, during which time he worked as a personal trainer. He moved into strength and conditioning and performance coaching more specifically around 2016 and eventually did his dissertation project on recovery strategies in elite youth professional football with several pro youth academies in Scotland. He then undertook his master's degree in 2018 in applied performance coaching. In 2018, he worked as the assistant S&C coach with the Glasgow Rocks, which is a professional basketball team in Scotland. At the beginning of 2019, he was asked to cover an outgoing strength and conditioning coach for a few weeks at Hamilton Academical Women's Football Club, and he's been in the women's game ever since. He started his own private coaching business called Cobra Conditioning in September of 2020, and a bit later, in February of 2021, joined Celtic FC Women, originally doing a PhD while working as the sports science and performance lead. He stepped away from working in a full-time capacity from January to May 2022, went back to private coaching after citing a PhD was not for him, but then returned to Celtic in June 2022 as the sports science performance lead. That role morphed into effectively overseeing the entire performance setup for the women's side of the club from the senior level through 4 academy age groups. In February of 24, he joined the Houston Dash as a performance coach, and then was made the head strength and conditioning coach going into the beginning of last season. He just recently joined San Diego Wave as lead performance coach, where he'll be at the start of this NWSL season. Andy, thanks so much for joining the Femme FC podcast.
Thank you for having me on. I'm really excited to be on.
Yes, so I reached out to you to come on because I had one of your former colleagues, Copa, on, and she had told me about how in the return to play process during some of the postpartum athletes that you all had at Houston, that you're really helpful in the return to contact portion and that you have kind of this framework that you utilize for return to contact. And that piqued my interest immediately because we spend so much time thinking about return to play and going from gym to on the pitch. There's a lot of focus on on-field rehab, but the return to contact kind of just gets like, okay, now you're doing contact. It has like this light bulb moment or light switch moment as opposed to a intentional thought out process. So I'd love to hear about how you kind of came up with this framework, what you were seeing that needed to be addressed, and kind of just some of the background info on your framework.
Yeah, so it's, to be honest, it kind of became something that originally it was like an idea where, and like it wasn't something I thought about specifically, it just kind of popped into my head. This was probably about a year and a half ago now, where we had Ryan Garris, who was coming back from pregnancy. She was the second player with the Dash in my time there who was coming back from pregnancy. And by that point, so I'd been at Houston about 6 months, and my role had kind of morphed into then taking a lot more ownership over elements of return to play. So Cope and I did a lot of stuff hand in hand, and that just kind of grew as we went. And as Ryan was coming back, it was like we're in this process of, return to play, and I'm doing a lot more stuff with her. And at one point I was kind of like, so how do we really like plan for the contacts here? Now I'm going to start taking her through a bit more of because the way it would typically work is Copa would really handle all of the first third, then we would kind of blend a lot of the middle third, and then I would take a bit more ownership of the final third. So we're in that early to mid stage, and I'm kind of like, well, I'm starting to do some contact stuff now, but it's like, how can we really put this together where we can start measuring it a bit more and really focusing a bit more on it? Because it's, like you said there, we have a lot of return to play, we have a lot of return to run, but where is this kind of bridge between both of them? Because in a chaotic invasion team sport, it's like there's going to be contact while we're running, there's going to be contact while we're fully integrated into full play. And it's like, how can we really start to think about that a bit deeper? And then probably about 6 months ago, we had a player coming back from a pretty bad ankle sprain, And so she's on her way back and I'm starting to do more contact stuff with her. And then it's like, okay, so I've kind of been formulating these ideas over the last year now. And it's like, now it's maybe time to actually try and put it into a framework. So it's like an ongoing process. It's kind of been ongoing for like the last year and a half. I guess every framework is ongoing and it changes and it morphs as, new research becomes available and, you learn things from lived experiences and stuff. So it's been kind of ongoing for the last year and a half, but it wasn't really until maybe 6 months ago where I thought, okay, now let's actually start putting this together into like an actual framework and try and, because you have so many thoughts, you want to try and put them on a page or into something that kind of formulates it a bit more. And that's kind of where it came from.
Great. Do you mind talking us through the framework? And you can go into as much detail as you want right now, or you can do kind of more bigger picture, higher level, and then we can get into the details and just explain it in a way that makes the most sense to you.
Yeah, so I guess from like an overall standpoint, to be honest, it's almost like a derivative, I guess, of the chaos control continuum. So it's kind of derived from that, but also we're using objective markers that are built off of GPS numbers. So like we're going to first and foremost look at what the game demands are. And that's not just from like the overall standpoint, because the game demands are the game demands, but they change based on how each club or each head coach wants to play the game. So the demands are going to be different there. And then per position group, they're going to be different even still. And then even within those positional groups, each individual is going to be different. So we're using those objective markers or GPS numbers to try and drive a lot of what we do. But at the same time, it's again based on that kind of like that chaos control continuum. So like early on in the process, if we're thinking about it from a framework standpoint, early on in the process, we're looking at controlled contact. Now, depending on what the injury is or what the player is coming back from or where they are in the rehab process by the time they start working with me a bit more, some of those controlled contacts are going to look a bit different. Then we just start working further and further and further towards the chaos end of it. So we may go controlled contacts where it's just the player and myself. Then middle of the pack, we start then adding in maybe elements of the ball and maybe another person involved. Potentially if say it's a day where I'm working with two players with two different injuries at two different stages of the rehab, that can be really good because it means I can take a bit more of a controlled approach from a contact standpoint with one player who needs that, but we have someone else there as well who's going through their rehab and they're a bit further along with the ball at their feet or whatever, and they're getting involved, and it makes things a bit more game like. So it's just adding more game like progressions as we go, and then by the time we get to the end, it's just making it as chaotic as possible, as close to the game as we can get, obviously within reason, while still bridging that gap between their rehab work and what they're doing in full training, because it can be really difficult to, and I'll probably talk about this a bit more later as well, it can be really difficult to measure and track contacts in a situation where you're in like a 6v6 possession game, for example, as opposed to if they're with me and it's just that player and myself. So it's just building further and further along that chaos control continuum or control chaos continuum, getting to the point where we're making them feel as comfortable as possible with different kinds of contacts. Sometimes it's a more holistic approach where if it's postpartum, we're doing all sorts of contacts. If it's ankle, if it's hamstring, if it's an upper body injury, for example, just modifying those contacts as they need to go and just trying to get them as comfortable and as ready for that chaos of the game as possible. And by the end, hopefully, or maybe the very second last step is a mix of full training or at least modified training and with me, and then in the end, once they're in full training and have had some of those, or at least a decent amount of those contact exposures, so they're at least a bit more comfortable with them and they're not just kind of getting thrown in right at the end in the deep end, effectively.
And are there other things that you consider throughout the kind of controlled chaos continuum framework in terms of, okay, like you mentioned, first it's player and yourself, and then maybe there's a ball involved, then you get other players involved. Is there within kind of like, let's just say early, mid, late, for sake of ease, are there other things that you consider to progress within each of those designations? So for example, like a higher intensity contact or like a slide tackle, something that's a little bit more intense of a contact, or whether it's that athlete is driving the contact or if they're simply receiving the contact. How do you go about progressing within each of those phases at different levels of control and chaos?
Yeah, so again, a lot of that potentially depends on what the injury is. There's a lot of different positional demands, of course. So maybe that alters based on attackers versus defenders or what the position actually is. So, for example, if it's if it's a number 6, so like a holding deep lying midfielder, the sort of physical contacts that they're going to experience in a game might be quite a bit different from if it's a fullback or a wing back, where a lot of their contacts are experienced in like a north-south running up and down the pitch, going shoulder to shoulder with opposition attackers or whatever it may be. So a lot of that kind of drives off of positional demands as well. But yeah, you effectively, I'm sure we'll go into some more specific examples as we go through, but things like you start a bit early, maybe we go up shoulder to shoulder if it's an ankle injury, for example. So the person that I kind of mentioned that sort of drove me to thinking about this in more of a framework sense, we're going up shoulder to shoulder. She's landing bilateral, she's landing unilateral. Once she's a bit more comfortable with that, and she's having those boxes ticked off from a medical standpoint as well, is then we start going into things being a bit more random. So we get the ball involved. So maybe someone throws the ball in and then she's going up for a header, or we're going up challenging for a header. And then once she's comfortable off of those landings, because you throw one extra thing, another sort of piece of chaos in there, as opposed to just getting bumped. You're then getting bumped with the ball involved. So that's another thing that you have to get used to without thinking about all these things specifically as we're going. And then after she's comfortable with that, we start moving up, we get the ball involved, maybe go up for a header, and then there's a second phase of play where we maybe start going 1v1. Also, I kind of look at contacts as well as not just in terms of like shoulder to shoulder or person to person contacts. It's like contact with the ball. So I've seen it before where sometimes maybe players are going back into an environment where they haven't like necessarily tested a blocked shot. Like especially if you're a defender, you're probably going to have to block a shot at some point or a cross. So that was something that we are, there's one specific example where we do like a 1v1, we have 2 mini goals. I'll be an attacker, she'll be a defender. There's a lot of lateral movement involved in there as well. And then at some point I'm going to burst and try and fire a ball into one of the mini goals, and then she's going to try and block that. So again, there's a bit of control in there, but there's an element of chaos as well. And then you bring in 2 balls or even 3 balls. So then she doesn't know which ball I'm going to go for. And then you can progress it again. So I hit the first one into a specific mini goal. The next 2 balls are live. I can go to either one of those and then go to either mini goal. So she's getting a lot of that lateral movement, that shuffling, that crossover running. And then we just kick it into high gear. And then she's probably going to have to try and block a shot at some point. And then we flip it. And then she gets to do all that from the attacking standpoint. And she's actually striking the ball as well. So there's still control in there. She knows at some point she's going to have to probably block a shot. She's going to try and block a shot at least. And so then we just kind of progress it from simple landings, bilateral simple landings, unilateral, then a bit more chaos, a bit more chaos, a bit more chaos. And then we just make it game related as much as we can before then she goes into like a small-sided game where hopefully she feels comfortable then, okay, she can block a shot because she's tried it already, a 2 or 3 in maybe quick succession as well. And so it's just about ramping up that intensity, and the chaos kind of goes with that.
That's a great point, that there's more to contact than a simple like shoulder to shoulder or, player to player contact, fighting for a 50-50 ball or anything else. There's, like I said, blocking shots, also like going to take a shot and having a defender right there about to block your shot. That's actually how I broke my leg. So that's, and as you're speaking, I'm getting like flashbacks of playing defender in college and just getting a cross right to my nose. So that's very good points, is that there's different levels of contact. And so I suppose what you're saying is that you would take the player whose rehab you're planning, and what are the demands that player will face in the game based on their position, based on the overall system of the team, the head coach's style of play, the team style of play, and then breaking that down into, okay, how can we get that, like, here's what they'll do in a game. That's the high end of the control chaos continuum. And then how do we regress that until it's just at its most basic form? And I like how you also mentioned that it's not just that you're taking a holistic approach in terms of, okay, landing bilaterally and then unilaterally. So all of the normal like physical progressions we would do kind of being married in to this framework as well. So would you mind talking through a little bit how you go about planning one of those sessions? And you can use the ankle sprain player as an example. And how are you also thinking about the other physical demands being placed on them within a session other than just the contact? Like, are you focusing just on the contact portion in certain sessions, or is it just kind of tied into, okay, we need to work on defending 1v1s today. That's where we're at in our on-field progression. So that's what level of contact there will be. How do you go about planning that?
So a lot of this goes kind of hand in hand in terms of the contacts. I'll try and keep the contact work married as closely as possible to from a data standpoint where we're at in that person's progression, because we're always building back from their game numbers. So we're build back from that. So say wherever they are in their progression, and this again, Copa and myself, when we were in Houston, we would run through that every day. Copa would build back from the GPS numbers. We would speak every morning about, okay, this is where she is today, this is where we're at here, and then I'm like, okay, so I'm going to start planning for this, and then start planning ahead from that. But either way, we're marrying the contacts with the GPS and the numbers and the targets that we're trying to hit as much as possible. So I would try and integrate those like as soon as possible. I would try, like, my approach has always kind of been, you call it ecological dynamics approach, constraints-based coaching approach, whatever you like, but like it's trying to keep things, or trying to make things as game-like as possible as soon as possible. So basically we're looking at, if it's, we have to hit on that day, I say it's a smaller space day, because basically we want to try and keep their cadence as close to the cadence of the team as possible. So if we are on a typical, say it's a tactical periodization head coach who wants to build with a 4-day build, say we're on the day where the team as a whole are on their smaller space day, their strength day, their intensive endurance, whatever you want to call it, we'll try and keep the player from a rehab standpoint on that cadence. So on that day, we would take a bit of a small space approach. So say maybe we're at a point near rehab where we're trying to hit maybe 75% of their typical that day. So their typical day if they're fully fit. So we'd look at maybe, I don't know, say it's 2.5k we're trying to hit for that day. Total distance, we obviously have high speed numbers, accel, decel numbers, sprint numbers. Now on a smaller space day, you're not going to have as much high speed running, obviously, because effectively you don't have the space to work into, but your accels and decel numbers, where they become very important. So then it's just about, from me, how can I integrate the contacts into exercises and drills that allow us to hit those numbers? Because obviously, yourself, not all numbers are equal. Not all distance is like created equal. So she could maybe hit 2.5k, but she could do that walking. It would take her a while, but she could do that walking. So it's then just about, okay, how can I put together exercises or drills, or put together a session with that player where we hit those numbers, but we integrate the contacts into it. And sometimes, like, again, a good example is what I just given previously, where we have the mini goals and there's a lot of lateral movement in there, a lot of blocking, hitting, and we're getting those contacts. And we may also do, I'd say it's a different exercise where we're almost, it's not quite a dribble track, but we're dribbling to a certain place, we're cutting, and I'm giving really heavy shoulder to shoulder contacts. I'm just being a complete nuisance. I'm pulling her shirt. I'm being like a real pain in the neck. So that kind of thing. So that she's just getting used to that as well. And we're building up our numbers that way, while integrating the contacts. The other thing as well is that for me, from a contact standpoint, I look at deceleration numbers. And this is where it's kind of going off track a little bit, but when I'm looking at the GPS numbers that we're trying to hit, those are the ones that we work with every single day. From more of a technical, tactical standpoint, we then start trying to tie in with the analysis department, where it's, okay, this player has this many tackles per game, she's involved in this many duels per game. So then I'm looking at, okay, these are our acceleration and deceleration numbers in a game. How might some of those actually come about? Is she decelerating, say as an advanced midfielder, she's decelerating because she's pressing, she's stopping, she's changing direction, pressing someone else? or as a bit more of a deep line midfielder, she's decelerating because someone's come and smashed into her, and she's had to stop, not through choice necessarily, but because she's in those physical contacts. So I'll try and integrate some of that into what they're doing and try and marry that again with the GPS numbers, just to try and make it as game-like as possible early on. So I'm planning building back from the GPS numbers, but also adding in those contacts as much as I can in drills or exercise selection that are live as much as possible. That can be difficult, and like when it's just the player and myself, but I'm trying to make them as live as possible, build through intensity, and using those drills and exercises to work up towards our targets every day. So it's just trying to integrate things as much as possible, and again, prepare them for what they're going to be expected to see in a game based on how we play once they're cleared off and fit to go again.
And I love how you just talked about getting the analysis of how that player plays. So like you were saying, like there's the GPS data, and we track that during rehabs and return to play. We have the match demands data from the GPS units. It's hard to get data on contacts. And I love the idea of going to the analysts and saying, okay, you know, they get this many decels in a game. And as you're saying, but is that from contact with another player? Is it because they're pressing and then holding a higher mid block? Like what is going on? What's the game context as to why they have that many decels? Can you talk through a little bit about what objective metrics you're tracking? Obviously, there's the GPS metrics that you just ran through, but how are you looking at that from a contact perspective? Are there any metrics that help tie in with that? Is there a way that you're monitoring the progression of contacts, whether that's number of contacts, intensity of contacts, or simply player response to the contact sessions?
So to be honest, there's a bit of both of those, because like it's very, very difficult unless, you know, there's someone standing with a notepad and actually doing tally marks and checking off how many contacts. It can, like, I'll maybe like plan for a certain number of contacts. Sometimes it's easy enough to do that if it's like early stage, where if I'm going up shoulder to shoulder, they're landing. We'll maybe do like 5 on the left side, 5 on the right side. Those things are pretty easy to track, and then they can be easy to then overload and progress. Once we start getting into that mid stage, and it's certainly towards the end stage, it can be very difficult to track those. So it's almost a bit of, then you kind of have to lean on the subjective element from the players themselves and how they're feeling. There's also a coach's eye standpoint where it's like, okay, if I'm working with this player, or say for example, it's Copa and myself, Copa's standing, she's watching their landings, she's getting an idea of how that looks. I'll maybe watch the film back later, I'll watch training back later, see them then, and then I can use like a movement screen then effectively. But from an objective tracking standpoint, I don't know what the best way to do that is, because it's very difficult to do that unless, like I said, it's a bit more on the control end. Then you can do it a bit more. But if we are saying we're maybe going, I don't know, 2 sets of, or say 4 sets of 10 seconds where we're in a small grid and there's lots of contacts, it might be a case of like if that player is trying to evade me, say she has an absolute stormer of a 2 minutes or however long the time is, and I don't get any contacts because I can't catch her. You know, it's one of those things. Or we flip the other end of it, and as she starts to fatigue, maybe there's less contacts because she's not catching me as much, or whatever it might be. It's just once it starts getting along that chaos side of things, it can be much more difficult to track the actual objective numbers of that. GPS is easy. They're wearing the pod, you know, it's easy enough. But contacts are more difficult, because I guess you then get into, so what constitutes a contact for us at this point of that player's rehab? Is going up shoulder to shoulder, is a bump a contact, is me, if she's trying to break away from me, is me pulling her back, is that a contact? So I guess it depends on what the contact is. How do you define what a contact is? And that's something that I try and wrestle with, because I'm not really sure in every phase of it. But then that's where it becomes really important, tying in with the player every day. How do they feel? Because then you can progress along towards the chaos end without the contact as well. Make things so it's a lot more cognitive demand. You just take the contacts out of it on a day where maybe from a physical standpoint, that's what's going to be best for her. So it's just about tying in with her at that point and then modifying it as needed. But yeah, I don't think there's a clear answer right now. I hope at some point I can come up with one. I doubt I will be able to be honest, because it's so random. You know, it's football, it is what it is. But it's just about progressing along, again, the chaos side of things, and then tying in with the player as much as possible.
Yeah, I suppose even if you tried to have an IMU or something like that, there's so much noise in that. And as you're saying, then it's counting something as a potential contact that you're not actually counting as a contact for that session because it's not what the focus is on. And it might be something that you've already done in an earlier phase or session and not
Yeah,
what you're trying to track in this session. So even that would be just way too much noise to even try to
yeah,
objectively measure.
yeah,
So I suppose then it's just, here's the session that we're working on today based on where you're at in your rehab, based on your positional match demands, as we spoke about. Here's what our target metrics are from a GPS perspective. And whatever naturally amount of contacts you're getting, yes, we can try to control for that to some extent, but it's football, it's soccer, it's what's going to happen if we're setting up the game situation as to replicate the match as much as we can, then you'll kind of naturally get the amount of contacts that you would get in that situation. Is that kind of the idea?
yeah. And another way I guess we can control that is if they're very late on in their return to play process, they may be in 75% of the full session at that point. We haven't fully ticked them off to the point where the full 100%. So it might be a case of a smaller space possession exercise, for example. Say the team as a whole are going to do 4 sets that day. It might be a case of that player does 2 sets. She comes out with me and maybe either supplements some contacts if we feel like they need it, or I can just tell her, like, just ease it up a bit, because that was a very physical set, for example. So like she's in there and she's getting bumped around, she's playing in the middle, she's winning balls, she's like flying into tackles or whatever. At that point, it's probably she's pretty close. But then it would be a case of, okay, so we control this slightly. That means we just drop the contacts a bit, or we supplement it as we need to, and whatever that may be at that point in her rehab. So yes, it's difficult. It's like it's random. It's chaos. It is what it is. But yeah, it's just about trying to find the right balance, I guess.
We talked about how there's these extensive frameworks that exist for return to running and the return to play phase, going on to the field as well. Are there any objective metrics that you and the team are looking at to begin initiating contact drills? Are there certain things that you want to see from them, whether that's in the gym or from a physical loading perspective or a physical output perspective, that you want to make sure they hit before you're initiating this?
So again, depending on what the injury might be, we'll have testing numbers, hopefully, from pre-season, so we know, like, for example, what their counter movement jump is. We'll know what their 5-10-5 is. If it's the ankle injury example and they're going to be doing a lot of lateral movement, I'll look at what the 5-10-5 was from pre-season, and then we'll maybe retest that. And then if they're close enough to what would be ideal, it may be a 10% deficit, whatever it may be, and then we'll kind of go by that. We could use single leg calf raise. We use that on the force frame. The force deck. You're using your force frames, your Nordic hamstring curls. So all of those things help drive decision making as well. There's also the coaching eye standpoint where, for example, if we are going to be doing some lateral contacts, then maybe I'll look at, okay, how are they doing just like a 180-degree cut? How does that feel? How does that look to me? How does that feel to them? And then it can be a case of, okay, let's come together and see, can we start progressing some contacts in this now? We're bumping shoulder to shoulder. We're going up. I'm giving you a bump. You're landing single leg. So it's a mixture of a few different things. But again, and this is probably comes back from my coaching background and like my philosophy towards coaching, which is it's based on self-determination theory. So a lot from a rehab standpoint is I'm giving players as much autonomy as possible. And I'm trying to rationalize everything that we're doing. Here's the reason we're doing this. This is why I think it's going to be beneficial, but I want the players' input as well. Because as soon as they become an active participant in their goal setting processes, like adherence and things just start to go through the roof. So like at that point, I'm trying to tie in with them every single day, establish a level of trust there where it's like, look, if you don't feel up to this today, we can easily modify this. We can strip it back a bit. We can still get some of our numbers in. It just means we take out some of the more chaotic elements. So if that's the case, and then we're having those conversations every day. That is a big thing. Like having that subjective side of things that marries into the objective side, and that's one of the things working with Copa and Houston. We had a very similar approach that way, which made it so much easier for everyone, because then the players know that, okay, the performance return to play guy, the medical staff, the physio, they're on the same page with my best interests at heart. It just makes things so much easier.
Yeah, you're speaking to all of my biases right now, which is great. I wanted to touch a little bit on like your point of marrying the subjective and the objective, and the objective data can be so helpful, right? It can help us kind of back up the decisions that we're making or guide us for future decisions. But you really can't discount, especially something like returning a player through stages of contact, where there is no great objective metric to be looking at for that specifically. And so a lot of it does come down to subjectively how the player is feeling, getting their input, and then your coach's eye and the experience that you have as a coach. And there's sometimes just that feel that you have working with an athlete that you can't objectively measure, that is just, I feel like something's off here, or I feel like they're flying through this and we can push a little bit further. What are the things that you're looking for from like the subjective coach's eye perspective that might help you recognize, okay, yeah, we can push this along, or, oh, there's something I just don't feel right about right now? How do you approach that?
So I guess I'll give examples like on both sides of the coin. So for example, last year in Houston, one of our players had a dislocated shoulder. She wound up getting shoulder surgery in the off season, so she was making her way back into contacts. So we did a lot of jumping, going shoulder to shoulder, bumping each other. At a certain point, we're going up shoulder to shoulder, and she is absolutely smashing into me, and it's like, okay, she's ready to go. Like you can tell. Like I've played football. I know what it's like when someone goes up and absolutely rams into you. She was ready at that point. You could see it anyway. And she's doing a lot of work with Copa, where Copa's like, she's like, Andy, she's flying through this. I'm now doing stuff with her. She's flying through that. It's like, okay, sometimes you can just tell. It's obvious. Same thing for like lower limb injuries as well, I guess. You're doing contact work. I'll cycle it back to the example with the 2 mini goals, and where I'm maybe trying to fire a ball into the mini goal. If a player looks like she's coming across, and there's a couple of players at Houston where blocking a shot is life or death for them. They will go and by any means necessary, they will block this shot. So we had one player coming back from pregnancy where we're doing a similar drill like that, and she's flying across as much as she can to block this shot. I'm like, okay, she's pretty comfortable with contacts here. On the flip side of that, I'll use the ankle example again. The first time we did that kind of exercise, and even before that, actually, even things on the landings, because one thing I'll do is we'll retest horizontal broad jump, bilateral and single leg, and like even from the single leg standpoint, you could tell, even if she wasn't up front with me, you could tell, okay, this is miles off where it would normally be. She was very tentative, understandably so, and she communicated that to me, which is great, because then it means I can scale back some of the contacts. But then as we start progressing that a bit more, we're doing the shoulder to shoulder example again, and then as she lands, I'm getting her making like a 10-yard burst. And the difference over the course of maybe 4 weeks of that, where the first time she would land and there would be that pause just to gather herself, just to test and see how it feels. Like that tells me, okay, she's probably not ready to progress yet. She's still tentative, completely understandable. You can see it on the other side. She was landing, she's flying, she's taking off. You can see the difference. That deficit is very obvious. So then it's a case of, okay, we just be patient and we just maybe try 1 or 2 other things in the gym. And then one day we may have been doing some loaded depth drops, or maybe counter movement jumps or depth jumps. I can't actually remember. But one day she did it and she's like, holy shit, this feels great. Like I haven't felt like this in like quite a while. She kind of got over that tentativeness. And then it's a case of, okay, now we go and start ramping up these contacts and start making things a bit more chaotic. So that a lot of that comes from her speaking to me, but you can also see when she's landing, she's going through that amortization phase and popping back up again rapidly. She hadn't done that in a while. And then we start doing a single leg and it's like, wow, she's like, this feels great. I can see that it looks good. There's very little hesitation there. There's very little tentativeness. So then it's okay, let's go and start making things chaotic. So it's really just about seeing it, them confirming it, and going from there. But yeah, like sometimes you will just know, okay, this player is flying, she's ready to go, she is in no way wary of these contacts. Let's progress her.
Yeah, that speaks so much to the idea of not just looking at objective outputs and metrics, but watching them do the thing while you're measuring it. Because like you're saying, I see this all the time in the clinic, is a single leg broad jump, and maybe they get the same distance, but you're watching them and they step up with their uninvolved side and fly through it, no problem.
Yeah.
Uninvolved side, they kind of stand there for a second and pause and maybe like start and then stop again, or the landing is just like stiff and kind of like nasty looking. And so even if you're just looking then at the output, like, oh, each leg they got X amount of distance, but you didn't see that. And that's where I think your point of marrying the subjective and the objective is so important, because it tells you so much in terms of their readiness and their comfort level to progress, or if a regression is needed, which ultimately just pushes them forward again. I'm curious, for practitioners who are working in soccer who maybe don't have a soccer background, if you'd be able to talk us through a little bit of how contact exposures maybe, and you talked a little bit about this earlier on, but maybe go into a little bit more about the different types of contacts, how it might differ for being in possession versus out of possession. And that might help frame a conversation around how to change and program contact exposures based on injury, based on position, et cetera.
So again, this has been like the previous 6 months sort of thing now, where I'm thinking about grouping these sort of contacts based on positional demand, attack v defense. Attack v defense is probably like the more broader approach. Then we narrow it in a bit. What's the positional demands? What's the positional contacts going to look like there? And then you start to group it in again based on in possession or out possession. So a few examples would be, as a central defender, what you're going to have to deal with a lot. And I mean, you see this from watching the game and stuff like that, if you've played the game as well. But what you're going to see a lot from a central defender is a ball from the opposition goalkeeper gets lumped up the field. There's a striker in front of you trying to win that header. They're going to be backing into you. So you're trying to like push them forward eventually to win the ball. So it's just about integrating elements of that, which you see that in a game like countless times. There may be defenders that have to deal with that a dozen times in a game. So it's just about then integrating that sort of stuff. That could be from a long ball. So we could strip away the long ball, for example, and just do maybe, I don't know, we do 8 reps of just that, where it's 3 seconds of, say I go the attacker in this scenario, the rehabbing player behind me, I'm backing into them and they're having to push me and hold their ground. So that would be like a early stage version of that. Then you start to integrate elements of where it's not just a defender dealing with an attacker from a long ball. There's attackers are going to take balls into feet and then either try and pop the ball off, try and hold it up, try and turn. So then from there, the defender has to, I'll go the attacker again in that scenario, I'm backing into them, I'm receiving a ball, and then we give the defender a decision to make. And again, we're having to interact with their environment. So say there's another couple of people, it may be Copa and another coach, where I have the opportunity to either pop that ball off to, say, Copa, and then I turn off and run in behind. And then the rehabbing player, she comes off of the contact and she makes a decision. Does she go and push the ball? Does she go and press? Does she run with me? Does she feel like she can step and win the ball? Or I may then take it, if I'm on a good day and I feel I can manage it, I can maybe turn it around the corner with the ball and drive. And she's getting more contacts then because I'm trying to hold her off. And she's contacting me, trying to, within reason, pull me back or whatever it might be to win the ball. And it's just another progression that way. So again, it's really just looking at what are the key sort of physical contact situations that a player might be involved in. I guess for a defender, that's a pretty obvious example because they're going to do that a lot, especially a central defender. If we're thinking about a wide player, one of the examples I gave earlier was, and I'll put it into, a rehab situation. Say I'm driving with the ball, she's trying to get back at me, we're trying to jostle, we're contacting there, she's trying to not cede ground, I'm trying to beat her. Or we flip it, if she's an attacking fullback, she's trying to drive down with the ball, I'm trying to jostle, I'm trying to win the ball, and how the level of how much I try to win the ball is basically increasing or decreasing intensity. So I may not be actively trying to win the ball, I'm just providing the contact, giving her some chaos to work around. Or I may be trying to win the ball, I'm like, look, I'm going to try and win the ball here, you're going to try and get away from me. If I can win this ball, I'm going to win this ball. Like, I'm going to tackle you here. So it's one of those things where then it's, okay, this is a full kind of situation that I would experience in a game. So it's just looking at what those positions will kind of experience from a physical contact standpoint. As a central midfielder, it becomes a whole lot more difficult because in theory you're doing a whole lot of that. You're doing a lot of the running and jostling and going shoulder to shoulder and tackling, especially if your role within a team is to really break up play and be doing a lot of that. But if you watch enough of it, you get an idea of what these positions are typically required to do from a physical contact standpoint. So I would say that if you don't necessarily have a background in football, I would say watch some. It sounds rudimentary, but watch some football, get an idea of what these positions are required to do. Get a look at the GPS numbers and try and marry that together. And then if you're in a position where you're starting to integrate some contact work in a return to play standpoint, try and make it as close to the game as possible, as quickly as possible, within reason, because obviously there's some things that you may not necessarily see it in a fully competitive game, but a lot of those high control, low chaos contacts early on in the process are still really vital.
Yeah, I really enjoy listening to your thought process of the framework. It really kind of ties in like this idea of when we're designing return to play and rehab sessions, you can't just think about what are the physical things that we need to get out of this player or that we need to address with this player. You need to think about the tactical and the technical sides of the game as well. And like you're saying, make it as game realistic as soon as you can. Get them on their regular cadence as early as you possibly can. I think those two things are so important, not just for making sure that they're physically prepared to return, but also that they're psychologically prepared to return and that you're setting them up for the best success, that they've practiced game-specific scenarios before they get back into a game scenario. So I think that helps psychologically, it helps physically, it helps with performance outputs as well. So Andy, before I let you go, I ask every guest 2 rapid fire fill in the blank questions. And so the first one is, I wish everyone working in women's soccer knew this about return to contact.
I wish they knew how valuable it could be, but while also acknowledging that it is by no means a silver bullet, and it's not one of those things where you can't just kind of take it as, okay, we'll do some return to contact work and that'll just tick off that box and then it's easy days, that's going to fix everything. It's by no means like that. It's also, I would say, don't sort of take it as don't take it as something that's not really worthwhile because they're going to get contacts eventually. There has to be a bridge there. I think it can be really valuable, but it's not going to solve every problem.
Yeah, I like that. It's not a single session. It's not okay, we're going to work on return to contact today. It's embedded within their program, but it's not something that you just leave and say, oh, they'll get it. You have to be intentional and think through that process. That's it's layered into, it's baked into what you're doing, but you have to consider it.
Yes, I also think that
go ahead.
Sorry, I think like the I guess the footballing example would be, as you're coming back, typically you're going to start doing lower intensity and lower cognitive demand passing exercises and technical work before you go in and start doing 5v5 small-sided games or 10v10 large-sided games. It's I guess the rehab equivalent of that to some extent. It's just about progressing and building up.
Yeah, exactly. And then the last fill in the blank question is, my favorite thing about working in women's soccer is?
The people. I think it's I'd worked in like men's football and men's academy football before, but like I said, like in you mentioned it at the start, I went into working with the team in Scotland on the off chance, that, basically just to cover for a couple of weeks. It wasn't necessarily anything I was looking to do on a long-term basis, and I get into it and just working with that group of players. Like after a couple of weeks, I just kind of knew that, all right, I want to stay in this. Like, and the women's game has been, the best thing I did, and I've been in it now for just over 7 years or whatever. So yeah, I would say that and a lot of that is working with those players every single day. I mean, I get that enjoyment out of every team and every sport that I've worked in, but like every team I've worked with, working with those players every single day, going and building those coach-athlete relationships, seeing them progress and stuff, that for me is the most rewarding thing. So yes, it's the people.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Andy. I really appreciate you coming on and talking through your framework. And I hope you have the best time in San Diego and have a enjoyable and successful, fulfilling time there.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's been good getting a lot of these thoughts out, not necessarily on paper, but throwing them out there and trying to formulate things. So no, I appreciate it. It's been really good.
Yeah, absolutely.